Hello, everybody. This is Alicia Garcia-Herrero. I'm senior fellow for Bruegel, and I cover lots of Asia issues. So sometimes I get confused with my own title. But I'm here today to introduce you a flagship report, an amazing report on global value chains. And it's going to be presented by Erik Berglöf, who is the Chief Economist for the AIIB, the Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank. And this report, which was presented at the annual meeting of the AIIB, has received a lot of attention because it does go in detail on the in and outs of something we always talk about, which is global value chains, but we kind of get confused about because it's hard to measure and it's hard to understand. And I think this report really bridges that gap and helps us figure out how these supply chains really work, where the bottlenecks, what we need for them to actually work even better. And then, of course, all of the intended and unintended consequences of supply chains, whether it's inflation, a hot topic today, the need for infrastructure, and of course, a little bit of geopolitics as well, as we all know. So on that basis, and I've not really introduced Erik, although Erik is so well known that beyond his current role at AIIB, he was professor at LSE. He's done amazing research even before this report. So I'm sure you all are very familiar with Erik. So I'm going to just stop here and leave the floor to Erik to make a presentation on the report. We'll then move to a few comments, which I will make very briefly to get your questions and pass them on to Erik. Thank you so much, Erik. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and appreciate those kind words. I must say that it's an absolute delight to be back at Bruegel, even though it's not physically, it's virtually. And it's also important because actually this work was very much inspired by work that you have done, Alicia, for Bruegel. And I think the issues that you have brought out in terms of thinking about the role of emerging economies in this global value chain was very inspiring for us. So let me share a presentation, and then we have a chance to discuss it. So these global value chains have, they are on the headlines basically every day now, and there's a lot of dislocation, a lot of disruptions in the global value chains, and we're all trying to understand where they come from. And of course, that was our starting point when we thought about this report, particularly, of course, trying to understand the impact of the pandemic on these global value chains. But as we were working with, we had the need to sort of understand more deeply the role of these global value chains and how they have changed over recent years, and also perhaps what are the challenges that they're facing going forward. So the it's not moving. This we should have checked. Okay, so just let me have the first picture. It's actually from a World Bank report that came out a couple of years ago, and I think it was a very thorough exercise. But of course, it didn't have the experience of the pandemic, and this report is very much building on what the World Bank had done initially. And this picture of a bicycle illustrates, I think, what global value chains are about, because you can see that every individual part of this bicycle comes from a different place, or at least there are many different countries involved. And the big lesson, I think, from global value chains is that they have opened up opportunities for countries, particularly emerging and developing countries, to come into this global production arrangement, because you no longer have to produce a whole bicycle or a whole car. You can just produce one component. And that is something that has been truly transformative for how global production is organized. And of course, given the importance that these value chains have for many emerging and developing countries, understanding the impact of the pandemic and looking at the challenges that they are facing is a very important project. So let me say something about the global context. So as I said, these have become very important, and we'll show you some numbers later on very important pathways for many emerging and developing economies to continue upgrading and developing their economies. Also, global value chains and infrastructure are deeply connected. It's not surprising, but we are trying to understand better how they are related, and also understand this mutual reinforcing dimension of this, that these global value chains put pressures on developing the infrastructure, and infrastructure allows these global value chains to develop and prosper. So that's going to be a very important part of my story. And we also wanted to understand there is this perception that global value chains somehow have stagnated because we talk about the share in total exports, and it's been about the same after a very rapid expansion in the early 2000s. After the global financial crisis, that share has been approximately stable. But actually that masks a lot of different things. One is that, of course, global trade has increased, so the actual volumes that go through these global value chains has increased. But more importantly, it has really shifted from advanced economies to emerging economies. So that's what we're going to try to say something more about. So there are a lot of challenges and also some very important opportunities for these global value chains. So the first thing, and what really triggered this report, was looking at the pandemic shocks. And so both on the lockdowns, so the initial lockdowns first in China, but then also in many other countries. And then the gradual and very importantly, not synchronized reopening of economies have also been a stress on these arrangements. The other thing, of course, is trade tensions and policy, and the uncertainty in trade policies have really impacted global value chains. And we'll have a little bit to say about that. And of course, that is also something that we will have to watch as it plays out in the future. And then there's technological change, of course, the digital infrastructure, and on the countries that are involved, their capacity to respond to these needs of further developing the global value chains and the technological challenges, that's going to be a very important part of it. But the last point, and the one that I think we really want to emphasize and plays a very important role in our report, is the challenge of greening or decarbonizing these global value chains and the increasing pressures on both the firms controlling these value chains, but also on the countries that want to attract these value chains. They need to think about how they can be part of this decarbonization story. And without saying too much, I think this is, if you look at the challenges that these global value chains face in the future, I think this dimension possibly dwarfs all the others. So that's why we wanted to put a lot of emphasis on that. So let me say a few words about the pandemic shocks. So I think we have all seen these impact, and of course it was very dramatic when much of the Chinese economy, particularly the part that was very deeply involved in these global value chains, when that part of the economy was closed down, of course it had an impact on the global value chains. But it was remarkable how quickly these global value chains held up to this, and how quickly they came back. And in particular, I would say that here, China's infrastructure and the logistics part of that infrastructure showed tremendous resilience and came back very quickly. But what we are seeing now, I would argue, is more the impact of what's happening as we reopen economies. lack of synchronization that I mentioned, this very large demand that has been created in part by these extraordinary policies, both monetary and fiscal policies, but also about all the pent-up savings that have been accumulated during the pandemic. So that is creating a lot of problems in many parts of the global value chains. And I would argue that it's too early to assess the impact on the GVCs of all this. And you know, it's a bit like when we talk about monetary policy now and inflation, and that there are, you know, a lot of seems like temporary influences on inflation. But of course, if you have a lot of temporary influences and they accumulate and they stretch over a long time, it all sort of becomes permanent. So we have to really be careful now when we look at the sort of long-term impact on global value chains. But underlying this is, of course, the economics of these global value chains, that we know that they are quite sticky, these arrangements, and that has to do with that they rely very heavily on relationships, and these relationships are important because they allow the transfer of sensitive information and important economically valuable information through these global value chains, and that is a feature that is not so easy to just shift from one value chain to another, or one supply line to another, or having dual supply lines. It is quite complicated, and the efficiency pressures that have been on these global value chains are not going away. So we should think about what are the long-term economic drivers of these global value chains when we go forward. So let me say a few words about how to think about this, looking at it from a country, or looking from first from the point of view of an industry or a firm trying to look at the relationship with what infrastructure you need and what kind of infrastructure you need to develop. So if you so the first point that we made earlier is that if you look at the participation in these global value chains, we should measure this in the share of exports, total exports that go for these global value chains. And normally we talk about the global value chains as goods that go more than once across a border. And here you can see that the red line is on top there is the advanced economies, and their participation has actually come down. But you can see that both for China and for other emerging economies, the participation has increased quite substantially. But even though this increase has been quite significant, there's still room for a lot more expansion in emerging economies. You can see that they still lag quite substantially behind advanced economies, and it's that opportunity, that growth, development opportunity, that is challenged by all these threats that we see to the global value chains. So when you think about your global value chains, you can move either upstream or you can move downstream. And there's nothing to say that it's one thing it's better than another. You have to really look at what are your comparative advantages, what activities can you be good at along the value chain. And so there's no one size fits all. And countries have chosen quite different strategies. If you look at China, has focused a lot on upgrading, of course, so increasing the high-tech share of production and introduce more technology into these global value chains. But also very importantly, and this may be the most dramatic shift in global value chains, have been the increasing share of intermediate goods that China produces. So China has both moved up and captured more of the intermediate goods. India, on the other hand, has focused on introducing particularly digital technology in individual activities and managed to become competitive in that way. So again, we shouldn't have a too strong a view on which direction to go. It really matters what your local conditions are and how you your strategy you choose in terms of your future development. So, as I said, the focus of this report is very much on the connection between the global value chains and infrastructure, and of course, disruptions to infrastructure. But infrastructure is incredibly important for these value chains because they leave it possible to break up the production process and exploit cost efficiencies that these global value chains have been so successful in exploiting. And that very much comes from the quality of infrastructure. Having said that, you probably also need a certain level of infrastructure, some basic electricity and transport in order to participate at all. And also we find evidence, and it's not surprising perhaps, but there's a strong correlation between the level of complex products that you produce and the demands on connectivity. So more complex goods require more infrastructure, puts more pressure on infrastructure. But you also have to think about which activities are you going to specialize in. Are you going to be involved in sort of pre-production activities, in design, research and development, brand building, and so on? Are you, then things like face-to-face knowledge, face-to-face interaction is very important. And if you can also specialize on post-production activities, after-sales service, ICT for engaging with customers and improving logistics and so on. So again, it's very much important that you think about which strategy, which activities you want to focus on. And of course, when you think about how to focus and where to emphasize your activities in the global value chains, you have to be cautious or conscious of the development of your digital infrastructure, and particularly some countries that have not managed to develop their digital infrastructure will have more difficulties in integrating into these global value chains. And of course, differences within countries also matter a lot for the possibilities to be inclusive in engaging in terms of in these global value chains. So if you look at India, there's a very large difference between, on the one hand, Kerala, where more than half of the population has full access to internet, and Odisha, where you have a much smaller, and you also, if you look at China, there's a strong correlation between the access to good internet services and exports. So the importance of digital infrastructure is very much there, and the capacity to exploit the benefits of these global value chains very much depend on to what extent you have been able to bridge this digital divide. So if you are not thinking about how to develop a sort of a infrastructure strategy that is aiming to join these global value chains, as I said, it's about the ability to break up production processes and exploit efficiencies, and also use the quality of your infrastructure. That is a very important consideration. You want to have different parts of the value chain and different sector require different types of infrastructure, and as I said, these digital divides are very important to keep in mind. So we're going to look at two countries that we had two chapters focusing on, and the first one is China and the global value chains. And it's, as we said at the outset, this increasing role of China is very clear when you look at what's happened to global value chains. So here's just a kind of a network showing how central China is to global value chains, and also looking at how China has managed to introduce more high tech into its global value chains. But maybe the most interesting and I think worth noting dimension of this is that this challenge that China has faced for many decades and arguably maybe centuries to try to develop the interior of China. That has really been helped by connections to the global value chains. And we spend quite a bit of time in this chapter to look at how and document how the access to infrastructure and both rails, but also other infrastructure. But particularly in China, what's important has been the railway connecting China and Europe, and the improvements in that form of transportation has really allowed places like Chengdu in Sichuan province and Chongqing to develop and become really high-tech centers that supplies very important, plays a very important role in global value chains. And you can also see here that also high-tech goods have become, many more parts of China become involved in the production of and exports of high-tech products. And maybe one last thing to note is that China is very much planning for a digital future and has become very aggressive in adopting robots. And of course, it has to do with the increasing labor costs, but also in the desire to integrate into these global value chains. And also in terms of the establishment of 5G and 5G towers around China, it's a lot of this is happening in the same places that we saw connected to global value chains. So this is a very important feature when you try to understand what's happened to the Chinese economy over the last couple of decades. Let me say a few words about India too. So India has also increased its GVC participation, and it has done so it has more than tripled, but still in a global comparison, it's still a relatively small player in here. And what is maybe most striking about the Indian development is that there are some states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, and a few others that have really dominate both in terms of infrastructure quality and the participation in these global value chains. So we show a very strong correlation between the quality of regional infrastructure and exports. And one thing that we spent a lot of time trying to understand and also visualize was the role of transportation networks connecting to ports and how those varied across India and how critical that was for the ability of firms located there to connect to global value chain. So very important in India is to spread this infrastructure more widely across states. So we also wanted to ask the question, so you're a policymaker sitting in an emerging and developing country, and you're trying to think of how can we become better at connecting to these global value chains, looking at the success of many other emerging developing countries in doing so. And we won't be able to give you a sort of full flavor here of the policy discussion in the report, but just one table that sort of illustrates some of the discussion that I think is important to have in mind when you reflect on this issue. So one dimension here is, are policies directed specifically at global value chains, or are they sort of global value chain neutral? And the other dimension is, are we focusing on a very specific geographic area, or are we more sort of place neutral? And so one example of something that's sort of focusing on global value chains and it's also very sort of place-based or place-focused are the special economic zones. And of course, we have seen both in China, but across much of Asia, a lot of use of special economic zones and sometimes successfully and sometimes maybe less so, but it is a very powerful tool if you get it right to attract global value chains. But at the other end, you have policies that are important, that are more GVC neutral and place neutral, like institutional quality, business environment, maybe soft infrastructure, things that can support the whole economy, but also benefit global value chains. And in this space, we can start discussing how to promote industrial development and thinking about particularly this spatial dimension of that. I think it gives you a sort of set of policy options that you can suppose. You can talk about sort of institutional support and soft infrastructure. You can talk about trade policy. We know there have been some important new agreements in Asia, and they can be very helpful for developing global value chains. There are place-based interventions, as we mentioned, special economic zones, and you can focus on institutional components, special export agencies, export promotion agencies, and so on. Those are tools that can be useful for countries wanting to join this global value chain. Let me end with a part that I think is going to be the main challenge facing these global value chains over the next couple of decades, and that's the net zero transition. And of course, given what's going on in Glasgow now, this is on everybody's mind, and it should be, because this is the real challenge for all of us, and of course for the global value chains as well. And when you think about the global value chains in the sort of net zero context, it's about, of course, giving access to renewable energy production. It's about renewable energy trade and allowing trade also across across borders. It's about utilizing your sort of green comparative advantage. And we talk here about the ability of countries to offer decarbonization opportunities to these lead firms in the global value chains. It's about greening of transports and logistics. And it's, of course, also about getting trade agreements and agreements on standards and so on that are very important for promoting global value chains and promoting decarbonization of global value chains. So here, clearly, these global value chain lead firms, so they have been so important for the evolution of global value chains, and it's their capacity to govern these very complex arrangements and impose standards across the whole value chain and do so in an increasingly efficient and sophisticated way. But this can also be exploited to promote decarbonization. So, for example, they can impose a carbon price, even if we don't make much progress on developing new markets that generate this price. We can put pressure on lead firms to price in the emissions impact of their production and their input, and of course also of the transportation that their production give rise to. They can also impose these common standards across the whole value chain, and this is a very powerful tool for getting cross-border enforcement. It's something that we are struggling with these international agreements. There's a lot of commitments, but it's very hard to fully enforce those commitments. Here's a way that we can enforce both across countries, but also across sectors, these standards and when it comes to decarbonization. And of course, the data transparency is going to be very important, and allowing these firms to force different stages of the value chain forcing also different phases of the value chain to become more transparent, and using that to put pressures on these firms to really push the decarbonization agenda. And the other side of this, of course, which is also very important to keep in mind, is the role that this puts on the host governments. I mean, the host governments now have an increasing pressure to offer decarbonization opportunities to these lead firms. And you can compete with renewable energy, you can compete with environmentally friendly and circular economy production, you can offer efficient and effective multimodal green transport systems, and you can maybe get access to inputs that preserve biodiversity. All those things provide additional incentives for these countries to live up to their commitments under the Paris Agreement and also going further. So this, I think, is a very important supplement, and it creates a kind of virtuous cycle of interaction between the activities of lead firms and the desire of host governments to offer opportunities for them to decarbonize. So let me summarize, and then I very much look forward to the discussion. So in short, these global value chains, they offer what we call climate smart development opportunities. They offer inclusive transformation opportunities to emerging and developing economies. And we have seen how that's happened, particularly in the last 10 years or 20 years. They provide us with an additional tool to achieve net zero transition. Again, this enforcement across countries, across sectors that we need more tools in the toolbox to achieve this. And finally, and maybe this is in the end the most important dimension, they allow us to build very large stakes in a peaceful coexistence and common prosperity, and by tying up countries and creating a desire to find common solutions and taking full benefit of the technological capacity and the creativity that we find in different parts of the world economy, and feeding them through a coherent system of global value chains is very much something that we want to achieve. So with those words, I give the floor back to you, Alicia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Erik. This has been great. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. This is my second time. We had the same discussion at the AIIB, and I learned a lot even with the second presentation, because I realized that at the core of your report is not only the need for infrastructure, but actually a much more complex, or actually accurate, I should say, definition of infrastructure, including the greening of our value chain. And as I commented then, this is indeed about 50% of global emissions. So, you're quite right to put this at the center of the report. I also read your op-ed, which I recommend to everybody on the South China Morning Post on this topic. So, it's a very an important call that you've made with this report before COP26, really focus on this. And I think, quite frankly, and ironically in a way, the slight, if I may use that word, delay in terms of net zero from Asia's perspective. So, and understandably so, because we're talking about emerging economies. But if you look at the actual timeline, you have all the way to 2070 for India, which is of course amazing for India. But I'm just saying that trend, which is government driven, might actually be somehow accelerated by the push of the corporations dealing with these countries in their supply chain. And that's the irony of things, that it might come from the least, suspects, because they may not want it, but they may be forced. They want it in terms of cost, but they may be forced because their clients won't take it otherwise. And I think we're starting to see this in as far as the business councils of US, Europe, or Australia or Canada are already pushing. So The governments may have delayed because they thought it would be too expensive and perhaps even detrimental for them to attract foreign direct investment. But at the end of the day, it might be the other way around, that foreign direct investors may need much tougher or much faster greening of their value chains to accommodate their customers' needs or at least their customers' values and intentions. So it's quite important in a way to read from the supply side, not only from the government side, which is what your report is doing. So I wanted to make that comment very quickly. I'm not going to make a long list of comments because I already have 2 questions to pass on to you, and I'm sure there will be more. But that was one. And the second one that I really want to mention is this idea of, well, actually I have 2 and 3, and I'll start with the third because it's slightly less controversial. The third one I have is the issue of the definition of infrastructure beyond the what I just said about emissions and climate change, into the data aspects and the digital part of the value chain, which is growing. We all know that. I mean, at Bruegel, and Nicolas Poitier has worked a lot on digital services and what it takes really to get us to more homogeneity. But as we see lately, what we have is perhaps more heterogeneity, meaning, data becoming more of a battleground rather than a solution to go beyond the existing integration through value chains. And I think that's a key question, really. I mean, how to create an infrastructure, and it's not only physical infrastructure, but it's more about standards and rules of cooperation for data, cross-border data exchanges, which make the value chain resilient to this issue, because otherwise we may end up having data as the cornerstone for value chains becoming more and more fragmented. And I think that is indeed a very crucial issue, in my opinion, which needs to be discussed. The third one, the thorny one, is really about this wake-up call, I would argue, since COVID. Of course, the trade war was in a way the starting point, but COVID in a way made that starting point much more, the awareness of people everywhere in the world became so high, because everybody was in a way affected by disruptions in the value chain during COVID, but even now, because prices are increasing, or we read all day long on what are we going to do for our Christmas presents. For me, this is the list of the problems that we have in the world, but that's a different topic. But yes, indeed, this is becoming an issue that even people ask you about, as an economist. I mean, what's happening with the value chain? Why? So beyond the usual suspects, which may be the lack of cross-border mobility, ports not working well, which we also discussed, which are indeed important, there's also the issue of lack of trust, if I may say. I mean, to put it very bluntly. So we've moved from reviews of the value chain in the US, different sectors. We've done the same in Europe with a slightly different intentions. For Europe, really, the aim was to include climate-related issues as well as human rights-related issues in the company's obligations, in a way, obligations of unveiling information on these 2 fronts. But now these 2 things are coming together in as far as the US and the EU have already identified key policies on technology, digital issues, and supply chains as an area of increased cooperation under the Trade and Technology Council last April. So these things that look like, okay, I'm scared after COVID, are starting to get together into some kind of coordinated move with a name that might be different from the original aim, at least from the European side. So the geopolitics, in other words, behind global supply chains are I think deserve some attention and some discussion in this event. So these are just my comments, but I'm not even going to give you any time to react because we have had this discussion and because we have wonderful questions. So the first one really is a little bit on my third point, sanctions. What's the influence of sanctions on China's role in the value chain? And the question is a little bit broader, but I'm going to narrow it down to the value chain. And then the second is really about vertical integration, although it's not written that way, but it's about local versus global value chains, which in my reading is, should we reshore? Should we produce more vertically? And what are the costs and benefits? And then the other one is slightly more, a little bit more focused. I know there are too many, but I'm going to give you the floor on these three. It's the role of new technologies. So 3D printing, or, will that shorten the value chain? Because you actually can integrate vertically much more easily because the role of labor gets reduced in a way. And there could be many other examples. I mentioned the role of digital services. I mean, all of these things go in the same direction. So I'm getting more, so I'm going to breathe here, give you the floor on these three questions. And if you want to take any of the comments I made, that's of course welcome. So the floor is yours, Erik.
Great, thank you. And thank you for your comments also. And as you said, the first question you touched on, which is geopolitics and sanctions. So we don't look very specifically at this, but obviously it's in the background and trying to understand what has happened both maybe before the pandemic in terms of trade policies, particularly from the US administration, but then of course this reinforced to some extent by the pandemic as well. So as I was saying at the outset, so I think there are those pressures that lead to or put pressure on these global value chains to maybe change a bit, and there's this idea of decoupling and so on. So those pressures are there. I think they're very real, but the argument we are making is that the pressures in the other direction towards further developing these established relationships, exploiting these efficiencies is also very strong. So it is too early to say how this is going to play out. And of course, geopolitics itself is also very hard to see how it's going to play out in the long term. But you could, I think, make an argument that these are almost smaller changes in terms of affecting how these global value chains are going to look in the future compared to the challenge of decarbonization and the net zero transition in terms of, and that goes to the second question, which is about the local versus global. And it may be that these decarbonization pressures really shifts towards nearshoring, towards finding ways of avoiding transporting things many times across borders and so on. And so I think that is clearly, I think, a feature of global value chains going forward. In terms of new technologies, so I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Clearly, as you were mentioning, these digital transformation has been extremely important for these global value chains. And as we were saying, these has really shifted from being the transportation of goods to become much more involved in services, but even more so in terms of transfer of information. Of course, there the digital technology has been extremely important, and that I think is something that will continue to reshape these global value chains. But there, my sense is that is reinforcing already existing trends in terms of exploiting existing efficiencies and using these established trust relationships and so on. So I think maybe those would be my answer to those three questions. And again, when we looked at all these threats to, I say threats, but there are challenges and opportunities, because I think that these global value chains, they represent so much potential also when it comes to decarbonization and the greening of the global economy, that pressure is going to dominate many of the other influences in our view.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point. Rather than seeing it as a problem with 50% of emissions, we should see it as a solution, because we can cut on those emissions, since these are companies at the end of the day, and they have a social corporate responsibility, and they want to, in a way, they will have to come up with solutions. So I think it's a very powerful proposition to see this.
In your initial comments, and I think that
yes.
The first comment was exactly about this multitude of pressures, or from many different directions are exercised on these companies, and you see all the commitments they're making in different alliances, and contexts.
Yeah.
And, there are going to be a lot of pressure on them from their various stakeholders, and not the least from their creditors. So we look at what's happening now in terms of central banks developing these scenarios for decarbonization, looking at climate risk as a very real thing in portfolios, forcing financial institutions to look at their credit portfolio and forcing their clients to get rid of climate risk to the largest extent possible. So you have pressures, and then you have civil society pressures, you have pressures from governments. So all that taken together, I think, dominates a lot of the other things we are reading about in the papers these days. So that is very much helpful.
Yes, indeed. No, it's a very good way to look at this, because at the end of the day, if we hold companies just simply guilty of the whole thing, what we're going to end up doing is fragmenting the world even further and moving towards globalization, if not deglobalization. So I think the companies are becoming more and more aware that this is a real risk. And I think that's why they are reacting beyond, of course, their values and dreams. But I think there's also a business case for them to react, which we are seeing very clearly. So I very much like that, your report is the very first where I see this idea that they can be part of the solution. And I think it's a very important one. We have one more question, and I think we'll end there. So I want to end in time, if not before time, which is a good habit for our compact events at Bruegel. And it's a little bit similar, but with a social aspect, meaning all of these technologies, we mentioned 3D printing before, which, yes, indeed can help shorten the value chain, which is by all means, of course, carbon positive, if I may use that expression, but has however, an unintended consequence, certainly both or again, taking jobs, is the labor aspect or the employment aspect of this new value chains, which are becoming more capital intensive. And again, because of that, maybe greener, but on the other hand, maybe not socially desirable. So how do you square the circle? How do you do both? And I think it's a very difficult question. It's not really, like exactly. I'm just putting those two questions together for those asking the questions. They may think I'm changing them a bit, which I am, but I just want to put the two things together. How should we design value chains in a way that are less polluting, but at the same time, do not create that vacuum, especially as you said, in emerging economies, because that's where the value chains are growing. And that's also where, in many cases, not everywhere, but in many cases, the population are growing and those jobs are needed. So how would you do that, Erik?
So obviously, these are very important questions. And when you look at the employment effect and how these value chain affects employment and also inclusion in economies, actually the evidence is there's not that much evidence, but the evidence suggests that actually these are job creating, they are inclusive. So there's evidence, for example, from Vietnam, that these create a lot of jobs and more jobs than other sectors. So these sectors that are involved in these global value chains, they can play a very important role in creating jobs for those growing populations. So I think that is, to me, less of a concern. I hear a lot from different civil society organizations on concerns about the divides that these engagement and these global value chains may create. I think this is a problem in terms of exploiting the digital or having a digital architecture that doesn't allow the population to fully benefit, or everyone in the population to benefit. So I think that requires additional investment from countries that want to join these global value chains. But again, the evidence is more that this actually creates jobs and includes more parts of the economy in productive activities. So yes, we'll have to watch this space. And of course, if there is a shift towards nearshoring and these new technologies may shift the fundamental conditions for these global value chains, we have to watch those consequences. But so far, the evidence is not that this is what's happening.
Thank you, Erik. I was thinking the way to end this event, you've done so much work on this, and I know it's been tough, and I've been, seeing your team really asking wonderful questions to improve on the report. I think I would recommend everybody to read it. But then I thought I should give you a chance to also ask us, meaning Bruegel or any other researcher listening to us today, what do you think is a gap in the literature? What is a gap that you would like to be filled based on your experience writing this report? I think that's an important question because we need to move further on this important topic. It's just too important. Your report was great, but we want to do more. So what's your recommendation for us?
Well, I think the last topic that you brought up is an important one. So trying to understand the broader social impact and how we can make the benefits of these global value chains that in a sort of global context, they have been inclusive. So new countries and new sectors in new countries have become involved in global production. That has been a positive development. But really looking at the impacts in terms of inclusion and social impact in individual countries, I think is an important area that I don't think we fully understand. As I said, there is some evidence and it's encouraging, but we need to understand this more fully. I think this is in between sort of a research and sort of policy call. So, articulating this perspective on the net zero transition from emerging and developing countries, because there's a lot of pressure, of course, on these countries now to live up to these commitments that they are making or are made for them in global in these global conversations in the COP26 and so on. Really looking at how is this interconnection between these lead firms of the global value chains and the emerging, looking at the evidence, where has it really impacted on, for example, decarbonization and so on. So that link, I think, it needs to be made more strongly, and I think that it might not be the deepest research, but it needs to be documented. There's a lot of good evidence now what individual companies are doing, but looking at it from the perspective, what is the impact of these measures that these global companies are doing? What are the impacts of that, and how can we reinforce these pressures in terms of decarbonization that these companies put? How can we support countries that want to play a role in providing conditions for decarbonization? That, I think, is something that we still need to work on and provide, an agenda globally that we can. Also, these multilateral development banks like AIIB can be involved in supporting that process and making sure that these countries in the emerging and developing world really use this opportunity and are allowed to use this opportunity to integrate into global production through offering strong decarbonization opportunities.
Absolutely. Actually, you nailed it there, because I hadn't thought about it. But of course, I mean, you can offer some carrots to the whole process, meaning involving the host country, of course, in multilaterals to then have this virtuous circle by which the companies also have some nice pressure from the host countries, and you who may then lend to the countries for them to then put the pressure on the companies and beyond their clients. So I think and of course somebody has to measure all of that. So think tankers out there should help. And I think that's the last word, a call for action for researchers listening to us, and thanking you wholeheartedly for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, AIIB. It's been a pleasure for Bruegel to have you present this wonderful flagship report to us and our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.